Hello, this is Stephen Coates of Antique Beat. Welcome to the 32 Londoners podcast series. Along with Suzette Field of A Curious Invitation, on May the 1st, we curated an extraordinary event on the EDF Energy London Eye. For one rotation, each of the Eye's 32 capsules was occupied by a speaker. Each speaker gave a talk on one of 32 significant born Londoners to a small audience. Here is Geoffrey Marsh on David Bowie.
So, just to introduce myself, my name is Geoffrey Marsh. I run the Department of Theatre and Performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And some of you came to the show we did last year, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you listen very attentively, there are two copies of the, it's not a catalogue, it's the book from the exhibition, and there'll be a quiz at the end with two prizes. So don't ruin it for two lucky people. So do listen carefully, but I won't be upset if you just want to enjoy a wonderful view. How many of you have been on the Millennium Wheel before? Have you all been on it before? Okay. Okay, and the other thing, this isn't a promo, it's going to sound like it, but if any of you didn't see the Bowie show, it's actually, it's just finished in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and it's opening in Berlin on the 21st of May. So if you want an excuse to go to Berlin, it's actually at the Martin Gropiusbau, which is the exhibition centre next to the Hansa Studios, where Bowie recorded his Heroes album in the late 70s. It's going to Chicago in the autumn, if you're in Chicago. It's going back to Paris. It's going to be the first exhibition at the new concert hall of the new Paris Symphony Orchestra. And then it's going off around the world again. But that's the nearest it's going to come if you want to go back and see the real thing. Is it? Okay, so yeah, just you have to play that. We're going to have a bit of music in the background. I'm going to shout over it. Okay. We've got about 20-25 minutes. And rather than try and tell you the entire story about David Bowie's life, which is in lots of books, there's over 60 books being published on David Bowie already, and there's 3 new ones coming out in the next 6 months, which gives a whole kind of publishing industry. I'm just going to concentrate on about 4 or 5 little stories, which I hope link Bowie to London, and maybe give you a little bit more of an insight into how he ended up in the way he has. If you don't like it, you can all shout and I'll do something else, but that's what I'm going to do until you tell me to stop. So the first thing to say is that Bowie actually left London almost exactly 40 years ago, the 29th of March 1974. That's when he got a Channel ferry to Europe. He wasn't expecting not to come back. He'd been advised by his tax advisors to go abroad. It's a period when the Rolling Stones and all those people went overseas. The government at the time was taxing you at 103 pence in the pound if you were earning a lot of money. So there were lots of incentives. So obviously the Stones went down to the south of France and all the rest of it. And in fact, Bowie went to America and started doing the Diamond Dogs tour. And although he didn't realise it at the time, of course, he never came back. He comes back to Britain every so often. But since then, he's become a kind of international person living in Los Angeles, then moving to Berlin, and then to New York, where he lives nowadays. And as is always said, he walks around the streets. So if you want to see him, it's quite extraordinary. You know, everybody knows where he lives, and he just wanders the streets. It's quite easy to see him. Now, the things I was just going to talk about were 5 things about Bowie. But before talking about him, I just wanted to talk about his father, because like a lot of music stars, they often sort of give the impression that they sort of appeared from nowhere. But in fact, Bowie's father was very interested in music, and since we're here, and just reached a point where you can start to see a bit over there, just behind Charing Cross Station, some of the older people here may remember the Lions Corner House. Do you remember the Lions? Yeah, that's used to be there. Pulled out about, what's it, 50 years ago, wasn't it? But in 1933, when David Bowie's father was 21, he inherited £3,000. His parents had died, and I don't know if he had a very happy childhood, but he had this inheritance. I'll give you some idea of £3,000. A typical semi-detached house, 1930s house, cost £500. So you could buy 6 houses with that. So that was a lot of money. So he inherited that in 21. Rather unfortunately, or I don't know if it's fortunately, he met a woman who was coming back from Vienna at the time. She was known as the Viennese Nightingale. Hilda was her real name. And she was a singer. She was fleeing from the Nazi takeover of Vienna, not the German Nazi takeover, the Austrian Nazi takeover. And she came back to England, and David Bowie's father fell instantly in love with her, just at the corner house, and he decided to marry her and to promote her. And so, extraordinarily enough, Bowie's father actually ran a nightclub in Soho in the 1930s. It's difficult to believe this. And it was called the Boopadoop Club. And in fact, extraordinarily enough, the building it's boarded up at the moment. It's in Charlotte Street. It's number 86. And until recently, it wasn't a nightclub. It's it's empty. In fact, it's got squatters in last time I went past it. But it was not what's known as the Swiss Bunde. It was big German area in London, particularly before the First World War, and it was like the Swiss sort of club. And his father used to sort of hire it out, and they used to do evenings there with Hilda playing the piano and singing. And the thing about that was Soho, we imagine it's quite rough now, Soho in the 1930s is a very, very rough place. And the short, and to get to the end of the story very quickly, is that Bowie's father lost all his money in a year. Whether it was from, I mean, it was obviously very corrupt, it was paying off the police, there were a lot of kind of heavy people in there. But basically, his father lost all that money, like quite a large amount of money, in less than a year, and then he went off to work for Dr. Barnardo's as their PR officer for the rest of his life. Sort of strange change. And of course, that was a period when charity work wasn't, I mean, it's quite common working for charities now, but that was quite rare at that time. And that was the period, again, some of the older people remember, when Barnardo's had those huge, like extraordinary Victorian buildings. So that was the background, and so that Bowie's father was always very, very interested in his career. He was very, very supportive of him when he started. And unlike a lot of musicians who have had to struggle, their parents want to do something else, he had that sort of backing. And I think when Bowie got going in the 60s, he was looking back to a period, only 30 years, the great sort of jazz age and that, when his father had been part of that sort of scene in London, which must at some level have been some sort of inspiration. Now, to move to Bowie himself, I'm not going to go into Bowie's family history, partly because I'm on being recorded. But anyone who has read anything about Bowie knows he has quite a complicated family. He's got 3 half-brothers and sisters, apart from anything else. And Hilda and his father split up in due course. And Bowie's father married again. And Bowie was born famously on the 8th of January 1947. Famously had shared the same birthday with Elvis Presley, which he always saw as great significance. But the key thing about it really was he was born just after the war, when London was a very, very grey place. I'm so old that I can remember when there were lots of bomb sites in London, but it was a sort of period when London had been very, very heavily bombed. We're looking down on the Festival of Britain site and the Royal Festival Hall. The Royal Festival Hall was the only new building that was allowed by the government because it was this great symbol of London sort of re-arising after the end of the war. But everything else was being used for emergency, get factories working again. The money that was available was being pumped into Europe to try and get Europe back on its feet. It was a very, very, very grey period. And David was born in Stansfield Road in Brixton, as some of you probably know. The house is still there. In fact, it was sold last year for some fantastic sum of money. And it's a rather peculiar story, but Hilda had adopted a girl, and that was going to be the house that she was going to give her. But when David's father came along with his new girlfriend, the house they were allowed to go and live in it. So from just after the end of the war, 1947, when Bowie was actually born there, for the first few years they lived in Brixton. And you can hear interviews with David talking about, that he grew up in a Brixton and there were lots of kind of black dudes walking the streets and all this sort of thing. But of course, Brixton wasn't like that in 1947. it had, in the Edwardian period, been a very grand period. Famously, it was the end of the last late-night tram out of the West End, which is why loads and loads of theatre people and music hall people used to have rooms there, because you could get home there very, very late at night, which is why Brixton's always had lots of rented accommodation in it. Obviously, after the war, a lot of people had left. It was very badly bombed, and it was going into decline. And these big Victorian houses were all being broken up into bedsits, you know, with gas cookers on the landings and all that sort of stuff. And so that most people who were kind of even vaguely aspirational, rather than doing now what they want to do nowadays, which is come and move into Brixton and places like that, were desperate to get out. And so David's parents were very typical of what I guess in America is called white flight from the city centres. But at that time, it wasn't really just, it was a kind of people just trying to get out of inner London, very, very dirty, got to remember, full of coal-fired houses and all that sort of stuff. And in fact, he went to live in Sundridge Park in Beckenham. And at that time, that was outside London. It was days before the GLC. It was London County Council. And his mother had actually grown up in Kent. And so it's very typical that his parents decided to move away from London and get out to the sort of more rolling suburbs. Is anyone here from Sundridge Park? Be careful. From? Bromley. How would you describe Sundridge Park? Very interesting. It's just north of Bromley. There's something unique about Sundridge Park. It's the only place in London that's on the branch line of a railway. It's extraordinary. There's a funny little line that goes off from, can't remember what the station is, and it goes down to North Bromley. But that's right, yeah. And it's about 12 miles from London, but it's a strange mixture because it's ultimate sort of 1930s suburbia, most of it. Sundridge Park itself was an 18th century house and a beautiful park. But again, if you read a lot of David Bowie's accounts, you know, it's growing up in Brixton, you know, all the kind of out on the street. But in fact, he was brought up in a real middle-class suburb, except that he was brought up in a visual. Oh, can you just see if you can find this out? Visual Aid A. If any of you are interested in exploring this book, this is Kevin Cann's book, which is an exhaustive book on Bowie's early life in London. But that's the house he lived. So I'll just pass it round in Plaistow Grove, and it was in a railway. It was a row of railway cottages by the station. And so, although he grew up in this very kind of middle class area, he lived in a in effect, sort of two up, two down house, and it didn't really even have a garden. There was a pub at the back. So you've got to imagine the young David, 8, 9, 10, that sort of age, you know, falling asleep in this house, you know, with the railway station and the pub. And most of his friends, when he grew up, had you know, proper gardens. And there's always been a big argument about whether he had a bathroom or not. Of course, it's very difficult to imagine growing up in a house without a bathroom nowadays. But of course, a lot of these railway workers' cottages at that time didn't. And I think part of his amazing ambition and driven to succeed was being in a relatively poor house in a very, very middle-class area. Now, can you just find the DVD? And did any of you see the Bowie film, by the way, of the exhibition? We did it on the last night of the exhibition. We did a cinema release film. We did it 200 screens. And I'm just going to say it's going to be released in the autumn again, if you missed it. And I'm just going to show you a little clip from it of the exhibition for those who didn't see the exhibition, and a bit about his childhood. So he was growing up in a very middle class suburb with sort of parents who were sort of quite aspirational. But again, you know, his father worked for a charity. It wasn't a sort of normal thing to do that. And so he's always thought slightly different. And again, as some of you know, he had a half-brother who eventually became schizophrenic, had a very somewhat rocky relationship with his parents, lived some of the time there, lived with other people, and eventually ended up in Cane Hill Asylum. Some of you may remember it. It used to be a huge place outside Croydon. It's been burnt down. And unfortunately, his half-brother committed suicide eventually. And so although he had these half-brothers and sisters, he had quite, you know, he was really an only child living in this rather strange environment, with his father going off every day up to London to work for Dr. Barnardo's. But Dr. Barnardo's was key in one way, that his father used to go through the records of, that used to come in, used to get given to, you know, for resale, you know, like Oxfam shops nowadays. And of course, it's difficult to remember at that time how difficult it was to buy records from overseas. I can remember when Richard Branson actually Sorry, it's not that one. It's that one. It's that one. When Richard Branson started his kind of mail order, and you could actually start buying stuff. And of course, at that time, in the 50s, the only way you could get records is if people actually physically brought them back from the States. Or there were a few shops like Dobell's. Anybody remember Dobell's in Charing Cross Road? Yeah, a few people remember that, where you could buy records. So what was fantastic, his father could pick up imports that people had sent into Barnardo's to be sold. And so from a very young, early age, he was getting interested in music that probably most of his age group would never come into contact with. And what's probably the most extraordinary thing, which I was just trying to show, if you go to about minute 10 in it, is that in the exhibition, virtually the first thing, and Bowie still has this in his flat, he bought a picture of Little Richard when he was 10 or 11 from Woolworths. Now, if you're 10 and 11, it's a pretty strange thing to buy. So, interestingly enough, Bowie wasn't part of the sort of 62, 63 that went in a group with 2 guitars and a singer and drums. The first thing he learnt was a saxophone, and his father bought him a saxophone, famously a Grafton sax. If you came to the exhibition, you might have seen it. The Grafton sax was extraordinary. It's first and only plastic saxophone ever made, designed by an Italian immigrant, actually, who lived in Grafton Road in London, which is why it's called it. But the key thing about it was a very, very good saxophone, actually. Lots of professional saxophone players had it, but it was half the price of a brass saxophone. And saxophones are really expensive. A brass sax was about 1/10 of the price of a car. So it gives you some idea of the backing that he got his father, that when he was sort of 11, 12, that he was given this. And it's the only instrument Bowie ever had any lessons in. Everything else he's self-taught, and he plays virtually everything else himself. So he got into that, he got into bands, and there's just one thing I want to show you, which is my son's 16. I have great difficulty getting him out of bed in the morning. That's David Bowie at 16. I mean, I think it's what I find extraordinary is you never see a bad photograph of David Bowie. Most 16. I mean, it's an extraordinary photograph when you look at it. I mean, if you look at it very carefully, it's completely constructed. It's like he's saying all these things about him. He's got the saxophone there. He joined this band, the Conrads, and the first thing he did was he put a hyphen in the title. And famously enough, when he left, they took the hyphen out. So he's even thinking of that sort of level of detail. The tie, very neatly, very like that. And it's amazing. It's almost like he's looking through the lens at you, and he's almost just trying to kiss you. And I think that gives you some idea that by 16, he was completely in control of thinking about himself as another person. And the key thing about when we did the exhibition was that everybody said, I've met David Bowie, or David Bowie doesn't exist. He's a construction. The real person is David Jones, who's quite a shy person, everybody says, very nice, very quiet. And he went out and constructed this character. And all the material that's in the archive we used is about David Bowie. There's nothing about him as a real person. It's all about this construction that he started at this time. And although he passed the 11 plus, he decided to go to a technical school. He left school at 16 in 1963, which is where I just want to move on, since we are moving round, to bring you to the map. I hope, if you've got time, that you go and do at least some of the walk here. But the thing that I just wanted to mention was that Bowie was very lucky that his art teacher, Owen Frampton, who was the father of Peter Frampton, the guitarist, by one of those strange coincidences, got him a job when he was 16 at an advertising agency in Bond Street called Nevin D. Hurst, which you probably haven't heard of. But in the early 60s, it was actually quite famous. And I don't know if you've all been watching Mad Men. Yeah. I mean, Bowie went and joined this advertising agency a little bit after Mad Men set in Madison Avenue, but it was a period when all that Madison Avenue was coming right straight into London. And also, it was the period after the Korean War when people got obsessed by the whole deal about brainwashing, could you manipulate people, how you could do it. Advertising, I mean, we're all so used to it now that we don't really sort of think about it. But that was the great period. And David's always very dismissive of his period. He was there for about a year. But actually, I think it's pretty fundamental. Like Andy Warhol, who did exactly the same thing. Andy Warhol worked in an advertising agency. I think it gave him this idea that actually, if you were clever enough and you thought things through with enough detail, you could actually really create characters and sort of manipulate your audience, which obviously he's been doing very successfully for the last 50 years. He left school 50 years ago last summer. And again, it's important to, although nowadays we sort of think, oh, the Beatles were kind of massive, they'd really only just started. I mean, it was really just that period, much more Cliff Richard and all that sort of stuff, and actually quite boring music in sort of 61, 62. But of course, he came up to London in 63, the Beatles were taken off the road, so it must have been so exciting. And of course, he had this 6 years from 1963 till 69, when he basically tried pretty much everything. He was a mod. He got into kind of hippie stuff and all the rest of it. But he had this real period of just grinding away and never really seemed to break through. But I think in that period he had some really great things about working in the West End. The first thing was he had access to records. Famously, his boss at the advertising agency used to send him out to buy records from Dobell's in the Charing Cross Road, which is, alas, no longer with us, which meant, again, he saw this astonishing range of music. I mean, everybody who ever dealt with Bowie says he's got this astronomical encyclopedic knowledge of all types of music. But of course the other thing was, this was the period when lots and lots of clubs were changing from playing jazz. We think of the Marquee Club as being a rock club, but originally it was a jazz club. And in 62, 63, you had this huge changeover to rhythm and blues. And by the time, 1965, by the time he was 18, on Sundays he had this thing called the Bowie Showboat in the Marquee Club, where they basically let him have the space and he could put bands on there. And he had a whole series of groups that he played with, which he seemed to pretty much fall out with one after another. And even brought out his first album in 1967 when he hadn't had a hit single. So all the time he was kind of pushing and pushing and pushing. And at a period when kind of pop videos were unknown and really only the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had kind of promotional films, really because they were no longer touring. In 1969, he actually made a half-hour promotional film. That gave you some idea of his kind of ambition. He changed his name. Yeah, he changed it. I mean, it's quite common. It's like Billy Fury and all those names. And his manager changed his name. So the initial it is Bowie because he's named after the Bowie knife. Although actually, even on it is pronounced obviously if you listen to things different ways. But that's what it was named after. But the real key, I think, to his interest in theatricality, and it's something that isn't really covered in most of the books about Bowie because they're mostly written by rock journalists who aren't particularly interested in theatre, is in 1967 he met Lindsay Kemp. Have any of you ever seen Lindsay Kemp live or in film?
Kate Bush.
Yeah. I mean, Lindsay Kemp, there's a sort of photograph here. Lindsay Kemp in the early 1960s was probably the most extraordinary person wandering around in London. If I can just find a photograph of him somewhere here. He lived above a strip club in Soho, and sorry, just bear with me a minute. And there's he in a feather boa. Now you've got to remember these photographs. Do you want to pass it round? I mean, you've got to remember that homosexuality was actually illegal in Britain until 1967. And even then, it was the law was only changed in England and Wales. It wasn't changed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So Lindsay was this absolutely sort of outrageous character wandering around. And, clearly Bowie and Lindsay just hit it off instantaneously. And the key thing about Lindsay was that he was an absolutely meticulous performer. He understood choreography, he understood representation, he understood dressing up, he understood makeup and all these sort of things. And I think it's very much from Lindsay and also his Bowie's girlfriend at the time, who was a classically trained dancer. They sort of had a tug of war over Bowie in the middle. That Bowie actually got this real idea that theatre wasn't just about dressing up and, sort of looking odd. It was about going onto a stage, and if you believed in something strongly enough and you could project it far enough, you could take people anywhere. And I think it was at that point that Bowie moved away from his earlier years with, the mod scene and all that sort of thing, and went off on this completely unique way. And although lots of performers, Lady Gaga for one, and not to mention any others, are used to dressing up and trying to look outrageous, very, very few of them really, really understand performance. It's interesting you mention Kate Bush, because she, although she's never done very much of it, is an absolutely extraordinary stage performer. And that's what I really think separated Bowie off. And although he obviously came really famous on the whole kind of glam rock period. I think glam rock was really just part of a much broader understanding that he had of performance. Having said that, and since we're here, just to a little story which I think shows you sort of how different the late 60s was. Bowie appeared at the, so I can't remember if it was the Queen Elizabeth Hall or the Purcell Room, but down here at the South Bank, which of course opened in 1968. It's difficult to imagine. The Festival Hall opened in 1951, but the Hayward Gallery and that opened in 1968. And Bowie doesn't very much do politics, but at that time he did have a thing, he did a sort of mime show about Tibet. And all the hardline Marxists came along with a little red book and chanted from the back of the thing, trying to get him off the stage because they thought he was being anti the Cultural Revolution. It's kind of difficult to imagine him in that sort of scene. But I kind of also guess it's difficult to imagine him commuting in for many years from Sundridge Park up to Charing Cross as a commuter into the late 60s. Time is rapidly moving by, so I just want to end, I think, the main bit, because I don't think we've got any questions they want to ask. But by talking about, I'll just find it, Space Oddity. Because it was Space Oddity that was really his first hit single, and really, I think after that he realised that sooner or later he was going to be a major success. And some of you may have seen this in the exhibition, but I know it's quite crowded. Just to explain, in the late 60s, no one, or up to 1967, no one had seen Earth from space, what it looked like. And famously, you know, people used to draw it as green. I mean, you know, that's what people thought, not because it was made of cheese, but because, you know, no one had really thought what it was. And there's an extraordinary guy called Stuart Brand, who's still alive, lives on a boat actually in San Francisco, who's really part of the counterculture out there in all sorts of ways. And he heard that NASA had taken satellite photographs of the Earth in 1967, and he started a campaign at Berkeley University to get these photographs released, because he thought that if people could see the world, this was the height of the Vietnam War, they might start thinking actually there were better things to do than trying to kill them ourselves. So he did that, but was unsuccessful actually, until quite bizarrely he started something which some of the older people, anybody here remember the Whole Earth catalogue? Anyone remember? Yeah. Who said yes? The Whole Earth catalogue was this extraordinary thing. Steve Jobs described it as the precursor of the internet. It was this extraordinary sort of information thing about kind of communal living. If you see a copy of it, it's worth buying. The first editions are worth a lot of money now. And Stuart founded it, and he wrote off to NASA and asked if he could have the photograph. So having had this huge campaign to get it, they provided the photograph. So on the first edition of it is the satellite photograph. But Bowie clearly, I don't think had ever seen that. But on Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo 8 went round the Earth for around the Moon for the first time. And if you want to hear it, it's on YouTube. There's a famous thing, because no one had actually planned to take any photographs of Earth. No one had thought about it. So they didn't have many photographs, and they're all meant to be of the Moon. And there's this argument in the space capsule as they come round, because as they came round from the back of the Moon, this is extraordinary, the sight. And this was the first time that human beings had seen the blue planet as we now know it. And there was this fight in the sort of cockpit saying, you know, I've got to take a photograph. And he'd say, no, we're not allowed to take photographs of the Earth. We don't take photographs of the Moon. It's on YouTube. It's quite extraordinary. And they took this photograph, and it was published in Time magazine on the cover on the 31st of, the end of the year. And it was published in the Times on the 6th of January. And it so happens that by the 13th of January, David Bowie had written Space Oddity. It's usually said that it's to do with the moon landing, but it's not, because in fact, when he wrote it, no one actually knew when the moon landing was going to be, because there was Apollo 9 and 10. Although it was talked about that it was going to be in this year, I'm absolutely certain that it was seeing this, that where Bowie says, you know, planet Earth is blue and there's nothing I can do. And that was really, I think, and perhaps as we go through the air, it's a good point to sort of bring this bit of the talk to end anyway, is that I think what fascinated Bowie was that he'd been brought up in this period after the war, during the Cold War, the space race, where everything was about going out there. And of course, what had happened with this, and of course was brought even more forcibly home, I'm so old I can actually remember it, in 1969 when Apollo 11 actually landed, there was nothing there. You know, everybody got out, giant step for mankind, but kind of, you know, it's a load of dust. And of course, what Bowie was really interested was underneath this was the kind of reaction against this led by people like William Burroughs and writers like J.G. Ballard, who coined this phrase, cosmonauts of inner space. The idea with the rise of the counterculture that you should be looking inside yourself, that the big journeys of the future weren't going out there, going off to Mars and setting up, you know, nuclear-powered greenhouses, but were going inside your own existence. And when you look at Bowie's recordings in 70, 71, 72, Aladdin Sane, Hunky Dory, The Man Who Sold the Earth, you know, a lot of it is about internal feelings, about sort of angst and about, you know, what's inside ourselves. And of course, it was this photograph and its publication which really started off the environmental movement. I think it was April 1970 was the first Earth Day. It's difficult to believe now, but obviously we live in a world, whether you agree with it or not, global warming, I'm not going to get into all that, but we live in a world where sustainability in one way or another has got to be, certainly from a design point of view, something that the world's got to come to terms with. And it really started off with this photograph. Yeah, so, but what I do think, I wouldn't say but what I do think it is, he captured the zeitgeist of the period. I think that, you know, he's a guy, I think, that he reads voraciously, he's always interested in the future and what's coming up, you know. So, I hope you found that of interest. I hope you enjoyed it, gave a little insight into London. It's a great city, London. I'm very proud to have lived most of my life in it. And I do believe that, you know, we do wander around a lot of London and miss it. And I hope if you do go on the David Bowie walk, just go and have a walk around, because places like Tin Pan Alley, you know, next to Denmark Street, next to Tottenham Court Road. Once Tottenham Court Road station reopens, it ain't going to be there any longer. You know, I mean, you know, the redevelopment and all the rest of it. There's all these things to preserve it, but it won't survive. And there are these extraordinary things.
Can I ask you all
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, folks.
Thanks for listening. 32 Londoners was sponsored by Hendrick's Gin, who created 32 unique cocktails, one for each capsule and for each of the 32 London boroughs. To hear more talks and for more information on 32 Londoners, go to 32londoners.com. For more information on Antique Beat or A Curious Invitation, go to antiquebeat.co.uk or acuriousinvitation.com.